What's the first word that comes to mind when you think of Sokka from Avatar: The Last Airbender? Smart, funny, boomerang? For me at least, it's brave. When we first meet Sokka, he's this immature, somewhat sexist kid.
Leave it to a girl to screw things up.
And one of the clever things about the show is that it's always pairing him off with strong women. Not just Toph or Katara, but characters like Princess Yue and Suki. He's the most insecure member of the gang, the one without bending. It makes him think that he's useless. But even early on in the show's run, it was careful to point out the value that Sokka brings. He was the only one that didn't fall for Jet's charm. He was often the one holding the group together. So as the show progresses, we see Sokka begin to learn from the strong women in his life. He begins to learn that this narrow view of power, of value, is wrong. You can be a strong fighter and a woman. You can be a strong fighter and not be a bender. Being a man, being a protector of your people, it doesn't mean being stupid, charging against an army alone. And it's only after he's able to recognize not just the value of his team, but the value of himself, that he's able to be the leader he wants to be. We define what makes a man a man. Power, strength, toughness. These are some of the things that come to my mind. But in Avatar: The Last Airbender, we see the writers interrogate those defining attributes, forcing us to question the traditional sense of masculinity. In the beginning of the series, Zuko's drank the Kool-Aid. He's a firm believer in might makes right, a believer in the glorious empire, a believer to the idea that vulnerability equals weakness, a believer to everything his father represents, to toxic masculinity. But Uncle Iroh forces Zuko and ourselves to question this. We come to learn that he was a firm believer in power, writing about his glorious successes, his siege of Ba Sing Se. And it's only after being exposed, being vulnerable through the loss of his son, that he realizes the error in his ways, and he sets out to make a difference. He learns the power of humility, the fallacy in believing that your way is the right way. He learns lessons and forms from all the other nations. He understands the misappropriation of survival of the fittest, and he sees the strength and practices others reject. It's how he comes to learn how to redirect lightning, having trust in his inner strength to make himself vulnerable. It's why in Tales of Ba Sing Se, we see Iroh help men across a variety of ages, still remorseful for the one he didn't save. When people talk about toxic masculinity, many will try to argue with you in bad faith. Uncle Iroh isn't not strong, isn't not tough. No, Uncle Iroh shows us that it's the loss of empathy, the inability to be vulnerable, to show emotion, to cry, to be weak, that creates men like Fire Lord Ozai and leads to the loss of so many others. What's the first word that comes to mind when I say Toph's name from Avatar: The Last Airbender? Strong, capable, earthbender, but more than likely the word wasn't blind, wasn't handicapped, wasn't disabled, because one of the things the show did well was making Toph multidimensional. There's a tendency for writers to focus on disability when writing it, or to completely ignore it. But what drives Toph's character arc isn't being blind, but the way her parents treated her for being blind. It's why she's so forceful, so gung-ho, and why she struggles to be mothered by Katara. It's something that shows us, the audience, that the problem isn't with the disability, it's with the society built around it. It's with the way we treat them. But the writers don't ignore the disability. In fact, we see Toph use it to her advantage multiple times, constantly having enemies underestimate her. And the show doesn't ignore the struggles of being blind. They acknowledge it throughout, usually taking the form of a lighthearted joke. Toph isn't the best earthbender because she's blind. She wasn't the first person to metal bend because she's blind. She did all these things because she's so much more than just one characteristic. Is Avatar: The Last Airbender a superhero show? It seems like a stupid question. Of course it's not. But the more you look at it, the more it starts to make sense. Almost each one of our core characters has an alter ego at some point during the show. Aang is both himself and the Avatar. Zuko is both Zuko the Firebender and Zuko the Blue Spirit. Katara is both herself and the Lady of the Lake. Toph is both herself and the Blind Bandit. Even Sokka is a swordmaster, a general, and each of our characters, but especially Aang, have a costume of sorts. The glider, his robes, the tattoos. Sure, they don't wear masks or capes, but there's plenty of superheroes who don't do that either. Sure, they're kids, but there are plenty of kids that are superheroes in stories too. But I don't think it's a superhero show. Despite the similarities in the power sets, the main difference is a narrative one. Avatar is a series about war, about colonialism. It's not about crime, it's not protecting a city or saving a cat from a tree. But even still, all we can say for sure is that oftentimes the boundaries between genres is blurred. What's the first word that comes to your mind when you hear Katara from Avatar: The Last Airbender? For me at least, it's hope. Take the episode where we see the gang lose Appa. Everyone is out of their element. The sand inhibits Toph's ability to feel vibrations in the earth. We see Sokka eat a cacti and begin hallucinating, taking away his ability to think. The loss of Appa's got into Aang, and we see him act out in desperation, lashing out again and again in anger, isolating himself from the rest of the group. In Katara, it's a desert. There's not a drop of water in sight. But instead of letting anger and apathy take her over, she holds on to the only thing that she has. Hope. Hope that they will get out of the desert. Hope that they'll find Appa. Hope that they'll save the world. It's the same hope we've seen her exhibit from day one, when she found Aang in the iceberg. It's why she's the one to figure out to guide themselves with the stars. It's why she gives water to the rest of the gang and not taking any for herself. It's why she's the one that doesn't stumble, doesn't fall. And it's why every time Aang loses control, it's Katara that's there to hold him and bring him back to a world filled with hope. Potentially controversial opinion I have about Avatar The Last Airbender is that Zuko and Katara definitely shouldn't have ended up together. Hold up, just stay with me all you Zutara fans. I think too often we only focus on Zuko, and not Katara, and we don't contextualize how they would see each other. Both Zuko and Katara's fathers are leaders of their respective groups. Both lose their mothers to the Fire Nation, and both have one brother or sister. Why is it that Katara beats Azula and not Zuko? It's because Azula was set up as the foil to Katara. Throughout the show, Katara shows strength and weakness. The loss of her mother has led her to being the matriarch, the nurturing one. But despite this, she's very powerful. She uses her bending in unique and creative ways. Meanwhile, the loss of Azula's mother only reinforced her desire for power, reinforced that empathy, emotion, weakness need to be snuffed out. Zuko sees Katara as the sister he never had, and Katara sees Zuko as a brother, both defined by their strength and weakness, their strength and caring, and how the death of their mother led to this evolution. What's the first word that comes to mind when I say Aang from Avatar The Last Airbender? Goofy, funny, powerful. For me at least, it's good. After 100 years of war, he's the beacon of hope. The one given immense power who doesn't want it. The one that feels guilty for actions that weren't his own. Aang blames himself for the 100 Years' War, for failing to live up to his responsibility as the Avatar. But throughout the course of the show, we see Aang learn to accept this. We see him reject the either-or fallacy, and learn nuance in blame and guilt. In the early episodes, he saw himself as 100% at fault, that none of this would have happened if he had stayed, hadn't run away. But the belief that he is 100% at fault, that denies the agency of those who actually were at fault. From the leaders of the Fire Nation, to the individual soldiers who are committing the crimes. Aang never forgives himself. He could have done more, but he learns to contextualize it, to realize and understand that he was just a kid, that guilt and shame can't be boiled down to one simple action, and that we can't be hyper-responsible for the actions of others, no matter how much power we really have. What makes something a tragedy? To me, it encompasses a sort of fall of grace, especially from circumstances of your own control, of your own making. And I think no character better represents this than Azula. We are all main characters in our own stories, and Azula sees herself as the chosen one, the hero, a prodigy from a young age. She saw herself as the one to take control, who would bring an end to the war and lead the Fire Nation to victory, civilizing the world with order. And her whole life, no one ever questioned her. She was their daddy's girl, a pure embodiment of might makes right. She wields relationships like weapons, whether it's with her brother or her friends. Everyone else is just a tool, a stepping stone, side characters to the climax of her own story, one that she believes wholeheartedly will end in victory, because she worships power, she worships her father, and she was great. But great people must be especially careful of what ideas they worship. So it's only when everyone's abandoned her, her brother, her friends, her father, that she realizes her story isn't that of victory, but of tragedy. Avatar at its best, Zuko alone. Zuko's at one of his lowest points at this moment. He's both physically and emotionally isolated. He's confused, and the only way he can figure out who he truly is to be alone. And we see him pulled between the two sides of himself, the burned and the natural. He thinks about robbing the couple for food, but sees she's pregnant and decides against it. He tries to ignore the children, but ends up becoming a sort of foster brother to the youngest one. He tries to hide that he's a firebender, and then later proclaims himself as Prince of the Fire Nation. There's a repeated motif of family in this episode, whether it's the pregnant woman from the couple he almost robs, to the family he stays with, to the flashbacks with his own family. Zuko's mom Ursa says, "That's what mothers are like. If you mess with her young, they'll bite you back." See, we know young Zuko's posturing in the flashbacks, trying to be tough, be mean, be like Azula. Nothing better represents this than a blade throughout the episode. It was a gift from Uncle Iroh, a representation of the best and worst parts of his past. So when the town finds out he's a firebender, Zuko boasts that he's the Prince of the Fire Nation, showing us, the audience, that he still doesn't know who he truly is. Aang and Zuko are both similar and opposite at the same time. Take the season 2 episode Bitter Work. In it, we see both Aang and Zuko struggle with a new form of bending. Aang must learn to be sturdy, to hold firm, to be something he doesn't seem to think he is. And after failing over and over again to generate lightning, we see Iroh use water bending as a method to teach Zuko how to redirect lightning. But again, the symmetry goes further. One of the most crucial parts of Aang's character arc is when he runs away from the Air Temple. When he runs away and he gets lost in the storm because he's running away from responsibilities in a world that doesn't seem to care about him. He's being thrusted into this role of responsibility that he doesn't want. And it's no coincidence that this is one of Zuko's lowest moments, that we see his frustration and anger boil over until he eventually runs away and faces his own storm, both literally and figuratively, staring into the void and asking the world to strike him down. Because they both have to learn, despite these expectations that they think others have for them, the world has no expectations, and the only ones that matter are the ones you have of yourself. The day Avatar was born, Season 1, Episode 12, The Storm. Aang doesn't want to grow up. Despite being over 100 years old, he still wants to run away from his responsibilities, from his actions, from his storm. Meanwhile, Zuko's greatest desire is to embrace his responsibility, to live up to his father's ideal, and shun his kind-hearted nature that has been burned over and over again by both the war and his father. Burned by his own storm. It's why the two characters are foils to one another. Aang, the pacifist, is gonna have to confront the war, confront the storm, and Zuko's struggle is between himself, his kind-hearted nature, and the shadow that his father cast on him, to embrace his humanity in the face of violence, to stand up to his father once again, like he did that led to his burn, and choose not to burn him back. Zuko's always cared for his fellow human, whether it's protecting the soldiers that he got burned for, or saving the crew on his own ship. It's these parallels that build the necessary investment and empathy with the characters in the world. A world where the villain can be defined by a selfless act, and the hero defined by a selfish one. What does war take from us? This is one of the guiding questions for Avatar: The Last Airbender. Violence and the ramification of the war loom over the gang the entire time. Even from the earliest episodes where we see them playing in booby-trapped ships, to dealing with the genocide of the airbenders, to leading refugees to safety. We see Earth Kingdom culture suppressed where they aren't allowed to do bending, and towns polluted from weapons manufacturing. And we see all the main characters and so many other children lose their childhood. We see the Water Tribe defend itself with children soldiers. From Zuko, a child himself, and it's a nuanced approach, asking us when the victims become the victimizers. Whether it's Jet and the Freedom Fighters, or Hama and bloodbending, the war has made them just as ruthless. One of my favorite moments of the show is when Katara can't bring herself to kill the killer of her mother. He's too pathetic. He's just a cog in the machine of war, the banality of evil. And we see Katara struggle with a way to hold a system accountable for evil. It's serendipitous that Aang wins, not through violence, but by sparing the life of the Fire Lord, breaking the cycle of violence. So to me at least, the purpose of Aang's childlike demeanor is a little different. Go check out that last video after this one, but the main point is that we can use contrast in a character's demeanor in order to show the stakes, to show how serious a moment is. And though this definitely occurs with Aang, it's not the main function that his childlike nature inhabits. Instead, it's used to amplify and contrast against the serious and horrific nature of war. See, unlike that prior example, we never doubt that Aang isn't giving it his all. Instead, he acts childish because he is a child. He shouldn't have to face these kinds of responsibilities. He shouldn't be forced to have to use his powers, sometimes in horrific ways, in order to save the world. And as we go through the show, we see him lose this immaturity to some extent. But it's important to note he never fully rejects it. He never becomes this fully jaded individual. He never becomes angry at the world for what it's taken from him. Ironically, in a show that's named after him, he comes to realize that it was never about him, but the naive, childlike idea of peace, of harmony that he represented. So what is it that makes a great side character? To me, I think there's no better example than Jet from Avatar: The Last Airbender. But it's not just his presence, his swagger, his hook swords that makes him so noteworthy. But instead, it's the dynamic he has with each member of the gang and what he reveals about them. Let's take Sokka. When we're first introduced to Jet, Sokka's immature, he's childish, and he believes since he's not a bender, he really can't make a difference, at least internally. But Jet, he directly challenges this identity that Sokka's built for himself up until this point. He's a leader, and he's not a bender. He's making a difference and he's fighting against the Fire Nation. He's everything Sokka sees himself as. He's a reflection of what the war can turn Sokka into, both the good and the bad. And for the rest of the show's run, he serves as this reference to what war can turn each of our main characters into. Because despite his skills, despite his knowledge, despite everything, he still feels powerless, serving as a reminder that violence leads to violence, and that the only way to break the cycle is to forgive. The end of Avatar shouldn't work. The fact that a lion turtle just shows up 20 minutes before the end to solve a problem that the show repeatedly has told us in multiple ways is seemingly impossible to solve. That of if he should kill Ozai or not. It should feel cheap, disingenuous. Everything we know about storytelling tells us that this shouldn't work. So why does it? Throughout the course of the show, Aang has been on a quest for power. A quest to master the elements, to master the Avatar state. And every example of power has been linked to violence from the very beginning. Aang burns Katara trying to learn firebending. Aang merges with the ocean and kills hundreds of people. And we're led to believe that Aang's ability to master the Avatar state comes down to his ability to shun his humanity, to turn away from Katara, to commit to killing Ozai. Those in power often view it as organized justly, but the real question isn't whether Aang should kill Ozai or not. It's whether in the face of power, in the face of violence, in the face of war, that we can retain our humanity and the inherent strength. One of my favorite small details in Avatar: The Last Airbender is the fixation with symmetry that the Fire Nation has. Whether it's Azula's frustration with her hair falling out of place, or the Fire Lord scorching only one side of Zuko's face, the Fire Lord family only having 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl, for their chosen ideal father and mother, until it all falls apart because it was all about power. You see Azula distraught, her hair all over the place and cut erratically in the final episode, highlighting her fall from grace. And it's this belief in our right way, a belief in power, that drives the Fire Nation, that drives the belief that they are right and that the other nations are savages, ironically destroying the idea of balance and symmetry that they champion in the world. So what makes Ozai such an effective villain in Avatar: The Last Airbender? On paper, it seems like he shouldn't work. We spend the first 2 seasons hardly interacting with him at all. He has no personal connection with our heroes, and arguably he's not even the main antagonist throughout most of the run. But despite all this, I think there are 2 things that really elevate him as a villain: the impact he has on characters we know throughout the series, and the mysterious nature to the character itself. See, throughout the first 2 seasons, we hardly get any interactions with Fire Lord Ozai, but we do see the effect his presence has on core characters. And we see these lasting scars of his presence, both literally and figuratively. Not just Zuko's scar, but Azula's mindset, or Iroh's fall from social standing, because Ozai's treated as a monster. It's like the emotional equivalent of Godzilla, not shown in his full terror until the final act. Instead, the first 2 seasons, all we see is the carnage he's left in his wake. And it's why, much like those big monster movies, even with such limited screen time, he has such a large impact on the story. So was Toph able to metal bend because she was blind? It's a good question. Though all earthbenders have seismic sense or earth sense, and I like to argue that it's just as much her determination that allowed her to develop metal bending as it was her blindness. It did provide her with a unique perspective, so that reminded me of another disabled character in the Avatar series, Teo. When Teo was just an infant, he was paralyzed from a flood that also took the life of his mother. But despite this, he became one of the best flyers, rivaled with Aang. There's an idea that necessity drives innovation, and because of this, the world becomes better when we take care of the most marginalized, the most disadvantaged, like the disabled. Teo's father, the mechanist, helped build a world where his son was more mobile than everyone, and there's a compounding effect to this technology. It led to the creation of the 2nd-generation glider that Aang used. It's important to acknowledge that in the real world, the disabled are often at a disadvantage. But it's just as important to realize that society gets better when we take care of the most vulnerable, directing innovation and energy to solve problems that don't affect us all directly, but nevertheless can change. So I really don't like the idea that you can have better or worse villains. Sure, you can have better and worse execution of a villain, but when it comes to Avatar versus The Legend of Korra, the villains serve a much different role. In Avatar, we're looking at the ramifications of war, and part of the series' goal is not just to show us the ramifications that those outside of the Fire Nation suffer, but also to show the impact that it has on the people of the Fire Nation. The fact of the matter is the Fire Nation is a fascist dictator state. And after 100 years of war, any and all political justifications of the fight boil down to might makes right. The idea that the Fire Nation is better. The idea that Lord Ozai is better. See, where The Legend of Korra is telling stories about how individuals use and abuse social and political systems in order to gain sole control, Avatar instead tells the story of what happens when they succeed. So it's easy to say that Avatar has worse villains than The Legend of Korra, because the main antagonists aren't villains at all. They're traumatized children, just ramifications of the authoritarian system of the... So yes and no, right? So Darth Vader and the Emperor have a similar dynamic, but I think it's a little different. In Avatar, I think it's understood that Fire Lord Ozai is the more powerful, more imposing force, right? Like, he's the father of Zuko, he's the big bad. But Vader and the Emperor take on a slightly different dynamic. The Emperor is presented as this schemer, always coming up with the plans, always in control. In my opinion, not always the best schemer, but that's a different video. And instead they give the gravitas, the power, to Vader. He's presented as this imposing, unfeeling force. Like, there's a reason he wears a mask. And like I talked about in the last video, the fear often comes from the dread of not knowing what you're facing. I think the best way to think about it is this. Both these red-hen men, Azula and Vader, are powerful and emotionally connected villains to our main characters. But Vader serves as a representation of what Luke could become, while Azula stands as a representation of what Zuko overcame. What makes a bad adaptation? For me at least, I don't get upset when a story varies from the plot. In my opinion, what makes an adaptation fail or succeed is its understanding of the characters and what they're trying to say with the story. When you change mediums, you can't tell the story exactly the same. And not just from a technical aspect, but also from a storytelling aspect. Certain things just don't convey. Animation can be more expressive, more unique. Live action's more realistic. Stage plays are often more dramatic. And that's just some of the examples of what's different between each medium. In the Avatar: The Last Airbender live-action movie, we don't have Aang, we have Aang. We don't have Sokka, we have Sokka. It's not Uncle Iroh, it's Iroh. These are superficial differences, but the real differences are in the characters themselves. Aang isn't lighthearted like he is in the show. Sokka isn't smart, he's just angry. We get no exploration of the main themes of the show. Themes of oppression, of war, of empathy and changing your perspective. Instead, we're given a mix mash of plot beats, combined and separate, hinting at the movie's desire to be true to the source material, but failing at the execution. What is Legend of Korra Season 1 about? The show tries to grapple with a lot of things, but to me, it's about balance. How should power be distributed in a modernized world? The Legend of Korra forgoes the dualistic nature of good versus evil. We see competing interests vying for power over the city. We still have a core antagonist, Amon. He's a radicalized outsider, striving for equality against the Benders. There's a lack of balance in the city, and many see those with bending ability as elevated above others in society. Amon challenges Korra both physically and philosophically. Korra is the manifestation of everything he claims to stand against. She didn't do anything to become the Avatar. She was given it, inherited it, and at first Korra rejects this lack of balance. She's defensive of the position of power she's been given. It's only after she acknowledges the truth that she did nothing special to get these powers is she able to empathize with the non-benders, the ones that stand against her, and that she's able to finally get the whole picture. There are those out there who act in bad faith, who weaponize fear and inequality. There's a reason Amon is a secret bender. He's a member of the privileged, masquerading as a voice of the discriminated. The world's changing, and with it brings opportunity to change society for the better. And the show argues that this devotion to a cause can blind people when wielded by a charismatic leader, and that it's only through recognition of the humanity in us all that we can see the path ahead for all of us. This isn't what happens at the end of The Legend of Korra. They don't kiss, they just hold hands and go on vacation together. The creators wanted them to fall in love and wanted to show that love, but even just 7 years ago, you weren't allowed to. I want to be very clear here. I don't blame the creator. Everything is created within a framework, within a system, whether it's shows like Avatar and Korra on Nickelodeon or this TikTok video. And this isn't the only example of the creators doing everything in their power to convey what they really want without breaking the so-called rules. I saw a video the other day highlighting all the times that instead of saying murder or death, Avatar used other ways to get the point across because they wouldn't air the episode otherwise. And the creators believed in their message, believed that their audience could understand the themes, even if they can't be as explicit as they want to be, or as they should be able to. Whether it's something as complicated as war and violence and torture, or something that should be so simple, like love. So what does The Legend of Korra and the new Star Wars sequels have in common? For me at least, it's how they handle their original characters. In order to start a new story, they both use a time jump. However, they include the original cast, the original characters, to give viewers and fans something to latch onto, something familiar. But the issue that they both run into is that either they've changed too much or they haven't changed at all. Let's start with Toph and Han Solo. At the end of their respective original stories, they understand that they can't be rogues, that they have to be part of a team, that they have to work together to be successful, that they care. But when we're introduced to them again, this has all been reverted. Han again is an outlaw. Toph has isolated herself and lives in a swamp. And then you have characters like Katara and Luke, both no longer active participants in the world, instead isolated, divergent versions of the hopeful optimist we knew before. Some characters get better treatment, Leia, Aang, Zuko, and it's a hard balance to strike, and one of the risks of introducing old characters years down the line. But I think we can all agree, there may not be a right way to do this, but there's definitely a wrong way. The Legend of Korra Season 2 further explores the idea of balance, but instead of confronting political balance in a modern world, it tackles spiritual balance. This divide is seen between her father and her uncle. Her father wants to adapt to change tradition to allow for the survival of her people. Meanwhile, her uncle considers this sacrilegious, leading to Korra once again finding herself stuck in the middle between change and tradition. As the daughter of the leader of the Southern Water Tribe, she represents change, the next generation of the Southern Water Tribe after the war. But as the Avatar, she represents one of the core ancient traditions of the world. She is the literal bridge to the spirit world, the literal connection between the past and the present, between tradition and change. And once again, we see a charismatic leader pervert insecurities and concerns to gain power, creating the Dark Avatar, a perversion of traditional values that guide the world. It's only through leaving the portal open that she's able to find success, a sign of adapting tradition while still respecting it, and leading to the balance the world needs. When people say Legend of Korra had better villains, they most always mean Zahir, because he represented the world in Korra's attempt to find balance between independence and attachment. Zahir's ideology is that of freedom, in particular freedom from attachment to the physical world, and that means freedom from all the systems that rule it. And we get this natural conflict. As the Avatar, Korra represents ultimate authority. Her responsibility isn't to herself, but to the entire world. Zahir's only attachment is to his fellow Red Lotus members, and as each of them fall, he becomes more detached, spiritually stronger in a sense, and only more ingrained in his worldview. And when he finally loses that last connection to the real world, his love, he's able to fully detach. We come to see Zahir as the perversion of the Airbender philosophy, a philosophy that uses separation and meditation to find peace, not to promote violence. Instead, he uses it to justify and rationalize his lack of perceived meaning in the world, his lack of humanity, of community, a community that comes together to put an end to his violence and destruction. Chaining and grounding him, a representation of his literal and Legend of Korra Season 4 is a story about balance. How long should someone who can make a difference stay impartial? Kuvira represents a real-world military populace. She weaponizes national identity and uses fear of the other to take power of the Earth Kingdom, claiming to restore its glory and honor. She claims to be an ally that fights back against elites like Korra, stoking more and more fear to justify her actions to grab more and more power. And it forces Korra to confront the power systems that she benefits from. If she, solely from the power she inherited, has a moral obligation to remain impartial in international conflict, or to step in and do what's right in affairs that don't impact you explicitly. Whether she wants to admit it or not, Korra has to confront the fact that she plays a critical role in power dynamics across the entire world. By defeating Kuvira, we see the Earth Kingdom and Korra herself reject both populist fear-mongering and establish systems of power. They remove the monarchy, choosing democracy, paralleling Korra's rejection of societal norms on a personal level, as her and Asami head to the spirit world together, free from the judgment that society imposes. So I don't know about you, but my favorite character in Avatar is Uncle Iroh, and it's because of the role he fills throughout the entire universe. You know, he's only the uncle to Zuko, but everyone, including the audience, refers to him as Uncle Iroh because he carries that familial, mentoring relationship to everyone he meets. From Zuko to Toph to Aang to Sokka, he's always there to have faith in one another, to show the way. Whether they're enemies or allies, friends or strangers, he approaches everyone with a sense of humility. He recognizes and sees the scars that life has left on us, and whether those scars have taken something from us or saved us, serving as this beautiful representation of the faith and trust we need to have in ourselves and in humanity that we all are so often lacking.
All hail the melon lord.